tRPC is amazing. You create a procedure, you call it from the front end, and it just works. But if that's all you know about it, then there's a lot that you're missing out on. My name is Chris. I go by CJE Online. I'm a teacher turned web developer based in Austria, on the core team of Create3 app, and also a contributor to tRPC. Thanks for watching, and I hope you get something out of this. In this video, we're going to take a look at the data flows in tRPC and the T3 stack. We're going to do this by taking just one single query, the one that renders this hello from tRPC on the landing page. And we're going to take this one query and follow it all the way through the code base, step by step building up this diagram you see on the left. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll come out feeling like you know a bit more about how tRPC works. So who is this video for? Well, it's specifically not a good first introduction to tRPC. If that's what you're looking for, I'd strongly recommend Chris Bautista's video from NextConf. I'll put a link to that in the description. The other thing I'd suggest is to just use Create3 app and initialize an app and start building something. That being said, you won't need super advanced tRPC knowledge to get something from this video. If you've used the use query and used mutation hooks, routers, and procedures, then that should be enough to be able to follow along here. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So if you've used tRPC before, you probably know that we use either a use query or use mutation hook in the front end, and then we have a procedure in the back end. And in VS Code, we have here the use query hook. And if we command click on hello, we land inside of the procedure in the back end. And that's kind of the magic of tRPC, that the front end and the back end are connected in this way. But really, there's quite a bit of other stuff happening in between those two things. So that's what we're going to be looking at now. So use query runs on the client and makes a network request. So we can open the network tab and refresh the page. And we'll see here this example.hello. And you can see it makes a GET request to localhost 3000/API/tRPC/example.hello. Then there's batch. We'll look at that a bit later. And there's also input. There's nothing magical about these HTTP requests, so we can make them from anywhere. For example, let's just type this into the browser URL bar, and you can see we get it back here the same way. So when we look at the JSON that we get back, there's a greeting that says hello and thanks for watching. And by the way, if you're enjoying this video, please click the like button and maybe even subscribe or tell a friend about this video. So where does this request go? Well, we can see in the URL that it goes to API/tRPC/example.hello. Next.js has file-based routing, so that gives us a hint for where to look. So we can go into pages/API/tRPC, and we see there's just one file there, which is a catch-all route. So let's take a look at it. Any request to API/tRPC/anything ends up here. So what we're looking at here is a Next.js API route. Next.js API routes export a default function that takes a request and response and then returns a status in JSON and so on. If you've ever used, for example, Express, then this probably looks fairly familiar. But this looks a bit different, and the reason is that we're using a bit of a shorthand here, so let's rewrite it in a way that might make it a bit easier to understand. So what we can do is, instead of exporting an API handler, we just create one. And we'll give it the same router, context, and onError function as we have down here. And I'll explain what those are and what they do a bit later. And then once we've created the API handler, we'll export a default function. Which takes a request, which is a next API request, and a response, which is a next API response. And it returns this handler that we created, and as arguments it takes the request and response. And we also need to import next API request up here, and they need to be types. And so what this does is that whenever any request comes into this API/tRPC route, it just says, hey, next API handler, here's the request and the response objects, please take care of this. And so what we've learned now is that this request ends up in this Next.js API endpoint, and then there it's passed on to the next API handler, which basically acts as the glue between Next.js and tRPC. So tRPC is not a backend in its own the way, for example, the Next.js backend or Express or Fastify are, but instead it's something that sits inside of another backend. And this API handler allows us, for example, to use tRPC Next.js, and there's a different function that allows us to use tRPC exactly the same way in Express.js. So whatever backend you're using, this API handler lets you use tRPC the same way no matter what kind of project you're in. So now let's take a look at this create context and the router. Let's start with context. Context is basically anything that we want to have available in every API route. We can look here in the create tRPC context, and you'll see here we're getting the session and then returning the inner tRPC context with that session being given to it. And the inner tRPC context returns the session again, and then it also returns Prisma, which is our database connection. And the reason we have this outer context and inner context is that in some cases we don't have access to the request and response, which we need here. Examples of that would be during static site generation or during testing. And so this create inner tRPC context works without needing request and response. So by default, in the case of Create T3 app, what we put in the context is your session and your database connection, but you can put anything in here. So let's go back to this hello procedure. And in the query, in addition to the input, we can get the context. And let's just console.log object.keys of context. And what that will do is tell us the keys of it. And now we can refresh the page here. And if we look in our console, we'll see that what's inside of context is session and Prisma. So now let's try adding something to our context. So we can go back into this tRPC file where the context is created. And for example, in the create inner tRPC context, we could say const hello equals world. In addition to session and Prisma, we also return hello. And now if we refresh the page here and then check our console, we'll see now the context has in it session, Prisma, and hello. And so that's how you add something to the context. So now we can add context to this diagram. And the way I'd put context in here is as kind of a side quest. So our main route is from all the way down here at use query to all the way up here at the procedure and then back down again. But in the API handler, we kind of make this little side escapade to get the context. And then once we have the context, we take it with us all the way to the procedure. We've looked at the context, so now the next important part of the API handler is the router. The API handler gets one router to begin with, that's kind of the root router. This is this router here. In our case, it's the app router, so let's jump to that. And here you can see it links to another router. Each router can have in it any number of procedures and any number of child routers. So in this case, we have one router that has one other router in it, and then this example router is one router that has 3 procedures in it. But you could also, for example, make a router that has 2 other routers and 2 other procedures in it. One way to think about it is that it's kind of like a file system in the sense that every folder can have more folders, but also files in it. The other thing about routers is that the names of the routers and of the procedures get used in the front end to name where your queries and mutations are. So if we look at the root router, we have this child named example. And then in the example router, we have this procedure here named hello. And if we go to our index.tsx file, you can see that this query lives at api.example.hello. It makes sense to structure your routers and procedures in an organized way, for example, by database resource. But as far as tRPC is concerned, it's all arbitrary. So that's the router. And before we can get to procedures, there's one more step along the way, and that's middleware. One way to think about middleware is that it kind of wraps around a procedure. So on the way in, you can modify the data that gets passed to the procedure and do anything else you might need to do. And on the way out, you can modify the output of the procedure and again, do anything else that you might need to do. It's first in, last out, or kind of like an onion. So the last middleware that runs before the procedure is the first middleware that runs after the procedure. Middleware in tRPC version 10 is applied on a per procedure level instead of being applied to all procedures at once. And one interesting fact about middleware is that input and output validation are also implemented as middleware under the hood. So in Create T3 app, we include this enforce user is auth middleware, and then we wrap it around a procedure and call that new procedure the protected procedure. But let's make a simpler middleware. So maybe the simplest middleware we could make is one that just console logs something. So let's go and do that. So it's a t.middleware. And it takes some stuff and then does some stuff. And the stuff it takes is context and a next function. And then what we'll do is just log in the middleware. And we'll return next with the context passed to it. Then we can create a procedure with it. And then we can go into our example router, and hello, instead of making it a public procedure, we'll make it a log procedure. And let's see what happens when we refresh the page. And you can see we get this log that says in the middleware, and then we get this log of the context that we had left in here from before. Now, in this case, we only use the middleware before the procedure, but we can also use it after the procedure. So let's go ahead and try that. Maybe we want to time how long a procedure takes. So we could, instead of console log middleware, call this the timing middleware. And then instead of a log procedure, this might be a timed procedure. And now we'll have to make this async because we will need to await the result of the procedure. And we can do console.time timing middleware. Then we can do const stuff equals await next. And we pass the context to it like before. Or I guess we can call this something better like response. Then we can do console.time end timing middleware. And then we can return the response. And I was getting a type error here, but it turns out I just had to restart my TypeScript server. Unfortunately, that's still an issue occasionally. But now we have this time procedure, and let's go back to our browser and refresh the page. And again, as before, we're logging our context here. And then right after, we're logging from within the timing middleware how long it took to run the procedure. If you check the tRPC documentation on middleware, you'll see a couple more examples of why you might want to use this. Here is a simple middleware that checks if the user is an admin. And anything that you can do in middleware, you could theoretically also do inside of a procedure, but by moving it out to the middleware, you make it reusable, which can be really nice when you're building a larger app. So that's middleware. And next we get to procedures. If you've used tRPC, you probably already know a few things about procedures. They can have input validators, which take a Zod schema. They can be either queries or mutations. You have access to the context and your input, and you make a return by just using the return keyword. But there's a few other things about procedures that I just quickly wanted to show. The first one is that you also have access to output validation. So just like there's input, you can also do .output, and this could be, for example, a Zod.object, and in it you have greeting, which is a Zod string. So this output is now correct. But for example, if I were to add something else, we would now get a type error because it's not possible for this function to return that. So why is this useful? Well, generally, you're not going to need it in most of your procedures. But for example, if you're working with an external API and you want to be very sure about the things that you're returning to your front end, for example, you might not want to leak certain credentials or other information, then putting an output validator is an extra step that can be worth it sometimes. The other thing I just quickly wanted to show is how error handling works. So tRPC has a special error type called the tRPC error, and we can just throw those anywhere in our procedures, and then we'll get the proper HTTP response back in the front end. So let's do an example of that. So the tRPC error takes an object and it needs a code, and you can also give it a cause and a message. And so in the code, you can see we get a list of all the possible errors, and these all map to HTTP errors. If you're not sure what some of them are, you can check in the tRPC documentation. For now, let's just do internal server error, and we can also include a message. We'll say boom. And now half the time, this procedure should throw that error. So let's go to the browser and take a look at that. And you can see we got lucky and we threw the error the first time. And if we take a look at the response, we get a JSON object here, and you can see we have the message of boom. And if we go back to the headers, it's a 500, which is an internal server error. So that's all it takes to get proper error handling and the associated HTTP responses in tRPC. So we already know that from the procedure, we go back to the middleware and kind of run through all of them backwards. Many of them might not do anything on the way out, but some might. Then we end back up at the router, back at the API handler, back at the Next.js API, where we now return the result of the API handler. And then the Next.js API endpoint sends a response back to our useQuery or useMutation hook. And that's how the data ends up in the front end. But there are a few more things we can take a look at. Forgot to add information about the request and response before, so let's add that in. And now there's one more big question remaining, which you might already have guessed if you've used tRPC before, which is how does it know? So for example, I can make a new query here and I'll do API. And then here I get the example router, and then it knows that I have these queries on it. And then it knows that it's a query, so I can use useQuery. And then in here, it knows that it takes text. Here, it knows that text is not a number, but a string. How does that work? So there's a couple of steps to this. If we go back to the root router, you can see the root router and all of its subrouters exist as one object, the app router object in our case. And you can see we're exporting a type that is the type of the app router. And what this type does is it describes what all the routers and the subrouters and the procedures are, and all of the input they take and all of the output they give. The second part is this create tRPC next function, which effectively creates our tRPC client for the front end. We'll take a look at the config a bit later, but first let's look at what's actually happening here. So we can go into create tRPC next, and here we can see this function which is with tRPC. If we go into that, we can see here that it returns a couple of providers. The first one is a tRPC provider. The second one is a query client provider, which is for React Query. And then it also returns a hydration boundary. And inside of that is the actual app. So this with tRPC, if we go into our app.tsx, you can see we're using API, which is this object that we export, which is the result of the create tRPC next function, .with tRPC, which is the providers that we just looked at, and then we wrap our app inside of the with tRPC. So that's how the providers get wrapped around our front end. But also this API object is the same API object that we're calling here to use our query. So that's how it knows what routers and what procedures there are and what input they take and what output they return. There's also a couple of other things worth mentioning about create tRPC next. So I said earlier that the use query and use mutation hooks are just a thin wrapper around React Query. One thing you can do in React Query is make some global configuration, and you can also do this in tRPC. And in the case of tRPC, you do it here instead of create tRPC next. So in addition to all of the other stuff that we're returning here, we can also add a query client config. And we can give it some default options. For example, we can say for queries, maybe we don't want to refetch on window focus for some reason. And if you were watching the IntelliSense, maybe you already saw that in addition to query client config, we can just give it an entire query client as well. The next thing you can see here is the transformer. We're using SuperJSON. And so you can see here we have SuperJSON as the transformer here. And if we go into tRPC.ts, which is where we initialize tRPC on the backend in the case of Create T3 app, we can see we're also using SuperJSON as a transformer here. What this allows us to do is it makes it easier to serialize and deserialize certain types of data structures that normal JSON struggles with. A common example of this is date times, which using SuperJSON, we can just send back and forth as they are. The next thing you can see here is links. Links effectively customize the interaction or the request flow between the client and the server. You can read a lot about them in the tRPC documentation, but for most apps, this combination of logger link and HTTP batch link is going to get you quite far. A couple that you might want to know about are the split link. So the split link takes a function that returns true or false and then returns either one link or another link depending on the result. This is useful, for example, if you want to use a WebSocket link for some types of requests and an HTTP link for other types. There's also the HTTP link, which is like the HTTP batch link, except it doesn't batch requests. Usually you're gonna want to batch requests, but for the rare exception where you don't want to, the HTTP link is there also. So now that we've added links, our diagram's complete. To answer the initial question of how this one query works, we start at the use query hook, travel through the links, then make a request to the Next.js API endpoint. In the API endpoint sits the API handler, which translates the request and response, gets the context, and passes it on to the router. Then from the router, we go through any number of middlewares, and then we get to the procedure. From the procedure, we get back to the middlewares, which might still do more things after the procedure. And then the data gets passed down to the router, to the API handler, to the next API endpoint. And the next API endpoint sends back an HTTP response, which again travels through the links and ends up as the result of our use query. In addition to that, we export types from the router, and we use those types with the create tRPC next function to create both the providers that wrap our app and also to have information about the structure of our API inside of the use query and use mutation hooks. There's one more thing I wanted to show, which are the router inputs and router outputs types. So what these do is they let us get to the type of the inputs and outputs of any of our tRPC procedures. To give an example, let's make a type hello input. And that will be equal to router inputs. You can see we get IntelliSense here. So we use router inputs example hello, and let's make the same for output. And if we hover these, we can see the hello input is text string, and hello output is greeting, which is also string, and that is the text we see here. So that's it for this little trip around tRPC. I hope this was helpful for you. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want to see more from me, you can subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or there's something else you'd like to see, just leave me a comment and I'll be sure to read those. And if you want to get in touch in some other ways, you can find me either on Twitter or on GitHub. And that's it. Thanks for watching.